Hello and welcome back everyone to yet another lesson in Python programming. In today's lesson, we are going to learn how to deal with external files using the Python programming language. Now, I've decided to break this specific topic up into two parts, and the rationale for this is so that we don't have one extremely long lesson. Now, with that said, let's have a look at the objectives for today's lesson. We'll start off by discussing the importance of file handling in Python, and then as per usual, we'll move on to a practical demonstration where we'll learn how to open and read external files. So what exactly is file handling in Python? Well, put simply, file handling is the process of working with files in a program. It involves opening, reading, writing, and closing files. The reason why this is so important is that there are certain use cases where we require our program to access external files to gather data, for example. The fundamental use cases in file handling includes the following: the ability to read data from a file, the ability to append data to an existing file, writing data to a file, creating files from scratch, as well as deleting existing files. Here is a typical example of what the code looks like for opening a file. First, we create a variable and assign the open function. We then specify the parameters, the first parameter here being the file that we'd like to access, and the operation, in this case, is read, which is indicated by the letter R. Once we've performed all operations within our file, we can simply close that file. Here is a more extensive example of opening a file as well as performing a read with the print function. Note that in the first line, we perform the exact same operation as before, that is to say creating a variable and opening a file with the specified parameters. We then create a new variable called contents and set this equal to file.read, which is a function. We then print the variable contents, which holds all the data in the file that's being read. And at the end, we close the file. In the event that we want to omit the file.close function, we can include the with keyword alongside the open function. This will allow Python to close the file automatically without you having to manually specify that the file needs to be closed after a certain operation. Now, with that said, it's time to dive right into yet another practical demonstration where we'll explore the concept of file handling with a hands-on approach. Now, as usual, we first have to create a new project. So I'll simply rename this project. I'll ensure that I'm located in my project folder tree over here. I'll then create a new directory and I'll simply call this lesson 4. I'll expand on this, click OK, make sure that my interpreter is set, and then I'll go ahead and click create. I'll open this up in a new window. So we want to remove all the boilerplate code, close off any notifications we might have. And the first example over here is going to be to simply just open a file. So on the first line, I'll create a variable called file. I'll set this to the open function. I'll then specify the file name. And the file name in this case is going to be myfile.txt. Great. The next thing we have to include is the operation. In this case, it's going to be a read operation. And on a new line, I'll simply just create a new variable called contents, set equal to file.read, and this is going to be our function. Also note that you want to wrap the R over here in strings. Next, I'm going to print the contents, and then I'll call the file.close function on the file. Now, I do suspect an error over here, and I'll explain why that's going to happen. So if I click run, notice that I'm getting an error called file not found. And that is because this file, myfile.txt, which is a text file, currently does not exist. So we are trying to open a file that does not exist. So how do I resolve this issue? And this is important. I first have to locate the directory in which this project has been stored. So that would be in my local D drive under Python source code -live, and I'll open lesson 4, which is the lesson we just created. I'll create a new text file over here, and I'll rename this to myfile.txt. The extension is extremely important over here. Then I'll open this file up, and I'll paste in some text. I'll then save this, minimize it, head back over to my PyCharm environment, and now if I run this code once again, we have a successful output. And we can see the output we have over here is exactly the contents of the file. That is to say, the data stored in our external file is now being read by our Python program. What is important to note over here is that this myfile.txt exists within the exact same folder as my main.py, the entry point of my program. So it's worthwhile keeping in mind that when you are trying to access a specific file, you want to make sure that the program has access in terms of the path as to where to find that file. For simplicity's sake, I created the text file directly within the folder where my main.py file is located. Excellent. Now let's try a somewhat more complex example. Now for this next example, we have somewhat of a more realistic use case. It's all good and well reading from a text file, but from a data science perspective or from a data analytics perspective, sometimes we want to read data from files such as CSV files that actually capture data. So in the exact same folder where I created the text file, I'm going to paste in a file that I've created called employee_data.csv. Notice that this is compatible with Excel. Let's open this file up. And what you'll notice is that in this specific file, in the first row, we have a couple of headings: name, department, employee ID. In our second row, we have John Smith, accounting department, and the employee's ID number. Likewise, we have a record for Erica and for Alex Peterson with varying departments and IDs. Now the goal here is to print out each and every single one of these records into our console. And that means the way we open and read data from a CSV file varies from a normal text file. So let's go ahead and do exactly that. Now back in my Python script, I'm going to remove all the code we worked on earlier. And then I'm going to start off by importing a specific module, a built-in module called CSV. Next, I'll move on to my opening statement so that I can access the document that we just reviewed. So I'll start off by using the with keyword. The with keyword just implies that instead of closing a document manually, when we are done executing our code, the document will be closed, or the file will be closed without you having to specify so manually. In our open function over here, I'm going to pass in the employee_data.csv. And next, I'm going to specify that this is going to be a read operation. Keep in mind that we want to wrap the R in quotation marks. Then I'll simply say as CSV_file. So in this one line of code, I'm simply opening this file as a CSV file, and I'm setting this to a read operation. Notice that I've also added colons, which means indentation is key over here. I'll create a new variable called CSV_reader, and I'm going to set this equal to CSV dot dictionary reader or dict reader, which is a function in Python. So what this is going to do is take in a parameter, and that's going to be CSV file. And this is going to return, this object or this function is going to return a dictionary that we can work with. I'll create a line count variable, and I'll set this equal to 0 because we want to have the first iteration of our loop start at 0. And then I'll create a for loop where for row in CSV_reader starts to iterate. If the line count, which is going to increment from 0 up until the last index of the item that we are trying to read from our CSV file, if this is equal to 0, well, then we'll take the line count and increment it. So we'll increment this value by 1. And now I'm simply going to copy and paste a single line of code over here. Let's just clean this up. So what exactly is happening over here? Well, we have a dictionary which is being returned into our row object, which is what we've included in our loop. And if we remember correctly, with dictionaries, we can access specific values provided we have the key. So notice that I also included an F over here. This is just to make sure that we can grab any variables from our row and add that to a string. So this is just for formatting purposes. Now, within the first iteration, the row is going to provide us with a specific name. Likewise, that same row is going to provide us with a specific department, as well as an employee ID. And everything else that you see over here, these are just strings that we've concatenated with the output that we expect to receive. We also want to make sure that our indentation is correctly set up. So I'm going to backspace just once over here to make sure that we are not within the if statement, but in fact we should be within the loop with this instance. And then on a new line, I'm going to increment once again. So I'll increment line count by 1. And now I'm simply just going to print with a formatting string to say that the lines processed, the line count over here, is the variable we created at the top of here. This will basically output the amount of lines that were processed in our code. So let's run this and see what our output looks like. You'll notice that we've retrieved John Smith that works in the accounting department and has an employee ID of ACC002. If we take a look at the Excel file or the CSV file that we worked with recently, you'll notice that that is in fact the case. We've managed to retrieve this entire record at line 2 over here. Likewise, we can see with the third line, we've retrieved Erica Meyers, who works in the IT department with an ID of IT003. We've simply just concatenated the output with a couple of string values. Now, what's important to note here is that this is in fact indeed a dictionary. What I'll do over here is remove this entire string and I'll simply replace it with just the row variable over here. And if I run my code now, you'll notice that we do have a dictionary with key value pairs. So all we've done within this print statement is just refactored our code so that we can concatenate it with a couple of strings to make a little more sense of this object. So instead of just having a default dictionary, the idea is to have an output that we can define and specify the way we want. And this is how we can work with CSV files in Python in the event that we'd like to read data for specific tasks. In our next lesson, which is part 2 of file handling in Python programming, we're going to deal with the remaining operations. That is appending and writing data to files. So for all of that and more, I'll see you in the next lesson. Cheers.